Welcome back to ShadeVault. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 true disturbing stories from the Alaskan polar night. These are tales of people who ventured into the endless darkness of winter's grip and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The research station sat about 40 miles inland from Utqiagvik, right at the edge of where the tundra starts to roll into these low, ancient hills. I'd taken the job as a winter caretaker because the pay was absurd, and I figured 3 months of darkness and solitude would help me finish my dissertation. The previous caretaker, an older man named Viktor Kozlov, spent maybe 20 minutes showing me around before he practically ran to the bush plane that was taking him out. I remember thinking that was odd, but I told myself he was just eager to see his family in Anchorage. The station itself was bigger than I expected, 3 connected modules arranged in a horseshoe shape around a central courtyard that was really just packed snow and ice. My first 2 weeks went exactly as planned. I'd wake up around what my body insisted was morning, even though it was pitch black outside, eat breakfast while watching the weather data compile, and then spend hours writing. The station was warm, well-stocked, and the satellite internet worked well enough for me to upload my work and video call my sister every few days. She kept asking if I was lonely out there, and honestly, I wasn't. I've always been comfortable with my own company, and there was something almost peaceful about the darkness. It felt like being wrapped in a heavy blanket, muffled and still. It was probably around the 3rd week when I started noticing the footprints. They appeared in the courtyard overnight, just a few at first, leading from the edge of the compound toward the main module, then stopping about 10 feet from the door. I assumed they were mine from when I'd gone out to check the generator, but when I looked closer, they were too small. My boots left deep, wide tracks. These were narrower, and the stride was shorter. I made a mental note to mention it in my next report to the research director, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe a fox, I told myself, even though foxes don't leave prints that look anything like boot tracks. The prints kept appearing, always in the same pattern, starting from the south edge of the compound, moving toward the main door, stopping, never reaching it. I'd gone out with a flashlight one night around what would have been 3 in the morning, swept the beam across the courtyard, and saw them fresh. The snow around them was undisturbed, like whatever made them had stepped very carefully, very deliberately. That's when I noticed something else. The prints were always in sets of 4. 4 identical tracks. Same depth, same stride. Then nothing. Then 4 more, about 6 feet away. Like something was jumping, landing on both feet, pausing, jumping again. I started keeping the exterior floodlights on at night. The sodium vapor lamps turned the courtyard into this harsh, orange-lit stage. And I'd find myself standing at the window in the main module, just watching. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me faster than I'd expected. My sister noticed during our next call. She said I looked tired, asked if I was sleeping okay. I lied and said I was fine, that I'd just been working hard on my writing. The truth was I'd been waking up every few hours, drawn to the window, checking for prints. On the 28th day, I kept a detailed log so I know the exact date. I saw it. I was at the window around midnight, coffee going cold in my hand, when movement caught my eye. Not in the courtyard, but beyond it, right at the edge where the floodlights faded into darkness. Something pale, low to the ground, moving in that same 4-beat pattern I'd seen in the prints. Jump, pause, jump, pause. It was too far away for me to see clearly, but I could make out a vague shape, roughly human-sized. But the proportions were wrong. The torso seemed too long, the limbs too short. It circled the courtyard once, staying just outside the light, and then disappeared into the darkness to the north. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the window with every light in the station blazing, my laptop open to a blank page I couldn't focus on. When dawn didn't come, because dawn doesn't come during polar night, and my watch said it was morning, I finally convinced myself to move away from the window. I made breakfast, tried to work, gave up, and just sat there listening to the hum of the generator and the occasional groan of the station settling in the cold. The next night, it came closer. I saw it again around the same time, but now it was well within the ring of floodlight, moving across the courtyard in that disturbing 4-beat rhythm. This time I could see it clearly, and I wish I couldn't have. It was pale, almost luminescent in the sodium light, and it moved on all fours, but not like any animal I'd ever seen. Its limbs bent at the wrong angles, elbows pointing sideways, knees bending backward. The head, I'm still not sure if I'd call it a head, was a smooth, featureless oval that swiveled as it moved, like it was scanning, looking for something, looking for me. It stopped directly in front of the main module door, exactly where the prince always stopped. Then it rose up on what I'll call its hind legs, and I realized it was tall, maybe 7 feet when fully extended, those 2 long arms hanging past where its knees would be if it had recognizable knees. It stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then it dropped back down and continued its circuit around the courtyard, never rushing, never hesitating. When it disappeared back into the darkness, I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I tried to call out that night, but the satellite link was down. Weather interference, the system said. Try again later. I sent an email to the research director marked urgent, explaining what I'd seen, asking for an early extraction. I have no idea if it sent. The internet connection indicator showed green, but who knows what that meant out there. I pulled up Victor's contact information and tried to call him directly, but it went straight to voicemail. His voice on the recording sounded strained, hurried. I hung up without leaving a message. It came every night after that. Always the same time, always the same pattern. Circle the courtyard. Approach the door. Stand and observe. Leave. I stopped going near the windows. I moved my sleeping bag into the interior hallway where there were no external views. Sealed the door to the main module with weather stripping I found in a supply closet. I lived off granola bars and water because the kitchen had windows and I couldn't make myself go in there anymore. My dissertation sat untouched. I counted the days until my contracted end date, crossing them off on a paper calendar because looking at my laptop made me think about my unanswered email. On the 47th night, I woke up to tapping, rhythmic, patient tapping on the module door. Not pounding, not scratching, just tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. I lay in my sleeping bag in the dark hallway, frozen, listening. It went on for hours. Sometime during that endless tapping, I realized something that made my mouth go completely dry. The tapping was on the interior door, the one I'd sealed, the one between me and the main module. Something was inside the station. I waited until I was sure it had stopped, until the silence had stretched so long my ears rang. Then I packed my emergency bag, put on every layer I owned, and forced myself to move. I didn't go through the main module. I used the maintenance tunnel that connected to the storage module, then out through the emergency exit. The cold hit me like a physical blow. 60 below with wind chill, but I barely felt it. I had a GPS beacon, emergency rations, and a snowmobile that I'd been shown how to use, but had never actually driven. I got it started on the 3rd try, hands shaking so hard I could barely work the controls. I drove north, away from the station, following the landmarks I'd memorized during my orientation. The darkness was absolute, my headlight the only source of illumination in a world of black. I didn't look back. I was terrified that if I looked back, I'd see something following, matching my pace with that 4-beat rhythm. The drive to the nearest outpost took 6 hours. I arrived with severe frostbite on 3 fingers and a core temperature low enough that they kept me hospitalized for a week. The research station was empty when they sent a team to investigate. All my belongings were there, my laptop still open on the table, my sleeping bag still in the hallway. No signs of forced entry, no structural damage. The only thing they found that they couldn't explain was in the main module. Someone, or something, had taken every loose object in the room and arranged them in a circle on the floor. Coffee cups, papers, pens, my boots that I'd left by the door, all in a perfect circle, each object carefully placed. In the center of the circle was my emergency bag, the one I'd been sure I'd taken with me, the one I'd packed before I left. I don't know what I actually carried out of that station. I don't know what I used to survive that drive. They offered me full pay and asked me not to discuss what happened publicly. I agreed, took the money, and moved to Phoenix. I didn't finish my dissertation. I don't do well with silence anymore, and I keep every light in my apartment on at night. Sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Then I'm awake again, and it's just the building settling, or a neighbor, or the heater. That's what I tell myself. It has to be. Story 2. My Uncle Garrett owned a trap line that ran about 70 miles east of Fairbanks, way out where the boreal forest thickens into something that feels older than the glaciers. When he died, sudden heart attack at 53, shoveling snow off his porch in November, the trap line became mine by default. I was his only family that still lived in Alaska, and nobody else wanted it. I'd never run traps in my life, barely knew how to skin a rabbit, but Uncle Garrett had been good to me when I was a kid, let me stay with him for a summer when my parents were going through their divorce. Running his trap line felt like something I owed him. The cabin was small, one room really, with a loft for sleeping and a wood stove that took up most of the floor space. Uncle Garrett had left it in good shape. Firewood stacked neatly outside, supplies organized on shelves made from old crates, his tools hanging from nails driven into the logs. There was a journal on the table, bound in cracked leather, filled with his handwriting documenting years of trap checks and animal counts. The entries were sparse, practical. Checked line south to Willow Creek, 2 marten, 1 fox. Reset traps, number 7 and number 12. That sort of thing. The last entry was from the previous February, almost 10 months earlier. Something following the line, moving traps. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals investigate trap lines, sometimes trigger them accidentally, sometimes successfully steal bait. It happens. I spent my first few days at the cabin just getting oriented, walking the nearest sections of line with the maps Uncle Garrett had drawn, learning where each trap was set. The polar night had settled in completely by then. This was early December, and I was doing everything by headlamp. The forest felt close in the darkness, like the trees were leaning in to watch me work. I kept seeing eye shine in my peripheral vision, which I assumed was ptarmigan or foxes, but every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The first trap I checked had been moved. Not triggered, not disturbed by an animal. Moved. It was hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground, the chain wrapped around the branch 3 times and tied in a knot I didn't recognize. The trap itself was open, functional, just completely relocated. I stood there in my headlamp beam, staring up at it, trying to figure out how an animal could have done that. They can't. Animals don't tie knots. Animals don't hang traps in trees with the care of someone decorating for Christmas. I checked the rest of the line that day. Out of 15 traps, 9 had been moved. All of them were in trees, all hung with that same careful knot, all still functional. None of them had caught anything, but the bait was gone from each one. Not eaten, gone. Removed cleanly, no blood, no scattered pieces. Just missing. I reset what I could reach, left the ones that were too high, and headed back to the cabin feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. That night, I read through more of Uncle Garrett's journal. The entries about something following the line went back almost 2 years. They were scattered, maybe once every few weeks, never detailed. Tracks again. Same as before. Found marker, moved north. Heard whistling, no source. Markers, I learned from studying his maps, were small cairns of stones he'd built to mark intersections in the trapline trail. Why someone or something would move them, I had no idea. I started noticing the whistling on my fourth night. I was lying in the loft, half asleep, when I heard it. A thin, reedy sound, like wind through a crack in a window, but musical, deliberate. It came from outside, somewhere to the east of the cabin, and it repeated the same 5-note sequence over and over. I'd almost convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks with the trees when it stopped abruptly mid-phrase. The silence afterward was worse than the sound. I didn't sleep much that night. Just lay there listening to the wood stove tick as it cooled, waiting for the whistling to start again. It didn't. The next day I found footprints around the cabin. They circled the building 3 times, always staying exactly 10 feet from the walls, and they were wrong in a way that made my eyes hurt to follow. They looked almost human, but the toes were too long, and they splayed outward at angles that didn't match any gait I'd ever seen. Between each footprint were these small holes in the snow, maybe an inch deep, like something had been dragging sticks as it walked. Or fingers. I thought about fingers and wished I hadn't. I should have left then. That's what I tell people now when they ask why I stayed. I should have packed my gear, hiked back to where I'd left my truck, and driven away. But Uncle Garrett's journal had entries for years. He'd dealt with whatever this was and kept running his line, kept surviving. I thought if he could manage it, so could I. Pride and stubbornness in equal measure. Same combination that's gotten me in trouble my whole life. The traps kept moving. Every day I'd go out and find them rearranged, sometimes all in one tree like a decorative cluster, sometimes scattered across the trail in a pattern that might have been a symbol or might have been random. I stopped resetting them. There was no point. Instead, I just walked the line, checking for any animals that might have been caught before the traps were moved, finding nothing. On the 8th day, I found something that wasn't a trap hanging from a tree. It was a piece of birch bark, maybe 2 feet long, with symbols burned into it. Not carved, burned, like someone had used a brand or a hot poker. The symbols looked almost like letters, but from no alphabet I recognized. They curled and intersected in ways that made my head pound when I looked at them too long. That night, the whistling came from multiple directions, north, east, south, all at once, surrounding the cabin. Same 5-note sequence, perfectly synchronized. I sat at the table with Uncle Garrett's rifle across my lap. Not that I thought I could shoot something I couldn't see, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. The whistling went on for 3 hours, never getting closer, never getting farther away. Then it stopped, and I heard footsteps on the cabin roof. Not walking, dancing. A rhythmic pattern of steps, light and quick, moving from one end of the roof to the other, and back again. The cabin roof was steeply pitched, covered in snow and ice. Nothing should have been able to move on it without sliding off, but whatever was up there danced like it was on flat ground. I could hear it humming now, not the whistling, but something deeper, a resonance I felt in my ribs more than heard with my ears. I sat frozen at the table, rifle forgotten, just listening to this thing move above me. When it finally left, and I only knew it left because the humming stopped and the dancing footsteps faded toward the edge of the roof, I realized I'd been holding my breath so long, my vision was starting to tunnel. Morning, or what passed for morning during polar night, came slowly. I packed my essential gear with shaking hands, left everything else, the journal, the maps, the tools, Uncle Garrett's entire legacy. I abandoned it all. I was halfway to the truck when I realized I was following footprints in the snow, those same wrong prints, splayed toes and drag marks, leading away from the cabin in exactly the direction I needed to go. I could either follow them or break trail through deep snow in a direction I wasn't confident about. I followed them. I didn't have a choice, not really. The prints led me straight to the truck, which should have been a relief. Instead, I felt like I was being herded, guided, allowed to leave. When I reached the vehicle, I found something on the hood. Another piece of birch bark, smaller this time, with just one symbol burned into it. It looked almost like a stick figure, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long, no head. Just an oval at the top of the body. I didn't touch it. I got in the truck, started the engine on the first try, thank God, and drove. I checked the rear-view mirror once, about 5 miles down the logging road, and saw something standing at the edge of my headlight's reach. Tall, pale, watching me leave. I didn't look again. The trap line is still there, legally still mine. The state sends me paperwork every year about maintaining it. I throw the papers away. Someone else can have it, someone braver or more foolish than me. Sometimes I wonder if Uncle Garrett's heart attack was really just a heart attack, or if he finally saw something out there that his heart couldn't take. His last journal entry keeps running through my head. Something following the line, moving traps. I think he knew it was getting bolder, coming closer. I think he knew what would happen eventually, but he kept going back anyway. I'm not that brave. I sold everything I owned in Alaska and moved to Seattle 6 months later. The city noise helps. There's never real silence here, never real darkness. I prefer it that way. Story 3. The mining camp had been closed since the 70s, just a collection of rotting buildings and rusted equipment about 15 miles up the Koyukuk River drainage. I was there as part of an environmental assessment team. We were documenting contamination from old mining operations, taking soil samples, checking water quality, the usual clean-up survey work before remediation could begin. There were 4 of us, me, my supervisor, Ellen Thorne, and 2 technicians from Anchorage named Page something, and Marcus Webb. We'd flown in on a helicopter that was scheduled to return for us in 5 days, right before Christmas. Plenty of time to do our surveys and get out before the weather turned bad. The camp had a main operations building that was more or less intact, roof only partially collapsed, walls still standing, most of the windows broken but covered with plywood by someone at some point. We set up our gear in there, sleeping bags on the 2nd floor where it seemed driest, equipment and supplies on the 1st. Ellen kept making jokes about mining camp ghosts, trying to lighten the mood, but none of us were really laughing. There was something oppressive about the place, even before anything happened. The silence was too complete, and the darkness felt heavier than it should have, like it had weight and pressure. We spent the first day establishing our survey grid and taking preliminary samples around the perimeter of the camp. Standard work, methodical and boring in the way field work usually is. Marcus found the entrance to one of the old mine shafts about 200 yards from the main building. It had been sealed with concrete and rebar sometime in the past, but the seal was cracked, chunks of concrete lying in the snow like broken teeth. Ellen photographed it, made notes about potential hazardous access, and flagged it to mention in our report. Nobody suggested going inside. Nobody wanted to. That night, Paige said she heard voices. We were in our sleeping bags on the 2nd floor, all trying to settle down despite the cold and the unfamiliar space. When she sat up and said, "Do you hear that?" We all went quiet, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, just the building creaking and the wind. But then I caught it, faint, muffled, like people talking far away. Except there was no one else for miles. Ellen suggested it might be the wind in the old ventilation shafts or animals in the walls. Reasonable explanations. We all wanted them to be true. The voices came every night after that. Always after we'd settled in, always seeming to come from below us, from the 1st floor or maybe even deeper. Marcus went down one night with a flashlight to investigate and came back up looking pale. He said the 1st floor was empty. gear exactly where we'd left it, but he kept feeling like someone was standing just outside his flashlight beam, some watching him, following him. When Ellen asked if he'd actually seen anyone, he said no, but his hands were shaking when he climbed back into his sleeping bag. We found the names on the third day. We were documenting one of the smaller outbuildings when Paige discovered a wall covered in carved letters. Names, dates, short messages. Most were from the 70s, miners marking their presence, the usual "Jim was here" type graffiti, but there was a section near the bottom, protected from weather by an overhang, where someone had carved something different. A list of names with a date beside them, December 18th, 1974. 13 names. Below the list, in different handwriting, someone had carved, "They didn't leave, they're still here." Ellen photographed it for the assessment records, but I could tell it bothered her. 50 years ago, almost to the day we were there. We looked up the date later on Marcus's tablet. We had spotty cell service, surprisingly, and found a brief newspaper article from Fairbanks about a mining accident. Cave-in at an unnamed Koyukuk operation. 13 men trapped underground. Rescue efforts unsuccessful. The article was dated December 20th, 1974, 2 days after the date carved in the wall. I slept badly that night. The voices seemed louder, and at one point I was sure I heard footsteps on the first floor, heavy boots on the wooden floorboards. When I finally gave up on sleep and sat up, I saw Marcus was awake too, staring at the doorway to the stairs. He looked at me, put a finger to his lips, and pointed down. We both sat there in the darkness, listening to something moving around below us. Slow, deliberate movement, like someone searching for something in the dark. It went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. Neither of us said anything about it the next morning, but I caught him glancing at the doorway repeatedly during breakfast, like he expected someone to walk through. The seal on the mine shaft had gotten worse. We walked past it on the 4th day while doing our final survey grid, and the crack had widened. More concrete chunks in the snow, and now we could see into the darkness beyond. Just a few feet, but enough to see old rail tracks disappearing into the earth. Ellen stood there for a long time, staring at it, before she said we should update our report to note accelerated deterioration. She made it sound professional, technical, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. That seal hadn't weathered apart. Something had broken it from the inside. That night we heard the whistling. Not wind, not ventilation shafts. Whistling. A tuneless, wandering melody that echoed through the building, seeming to come from everywhere at once. We all heard it this time, couldn't pretend it was imagination or explain it away. Paige wanted to leave immediately, hike down to the river, and try to get cell signal to call for early extraction. Ellen talked her down, reminded her we'd freeze trying to travel at night in December. "Better to wait until morning," she said. One more night. The helicopter was coming tomorrow afternoon anyway. I wish we'd listened to Paige. Around midnight, I woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, something more acrid and chemical, with an underneath scent of stone and wet earth. Everyone else was awake too, sitting up in their sleeping bags, coughing. The smell was getting stronger, and now I could hear something that sounded like pickaxes ringing against stone. Rhythmic, steady, coming from beneath us. Marcus shone his flashlight down through a gap in the floorboards. There were several places where the second floor didn't quite meet the walls properly, and jerked back like he'd been shocked. "There's light down there," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "There's light and shadows moving." We all looked. He was right. Through the gaps in the floorboards, we could see a faint orange glow from the first floor, flickering like lantern light, and shadows passing back and forth. The sound of pickaxes got louder, and now there were voices, lots of them, talking and shouting over each other. We couldn't make out words, just the cadence of conversation and work. The sounds of men working underground. 13 men who'd been trapped 50 years ago, maybe, still digging, still trying to find their way out. Ellen made the decision. We were leaving, middle of the night, cold and darkness be damned. We packed our emergency gear in under 2 minutes, left everything else. The stairs down to the first floor seemed longer than they should have been, and the temperature dropped with every step. By the time we reached the bottom, I could see my breath fogging thick and white in my flashlight beam. The first floor was empty. No orange light, no shadows, no one working, just our equipment exactly where we'd left it, and the smell of smoke slowly fading. We left through the front door, and I'll never forget what we saw in the snow outside. Footprints. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all leading from the direction of the sealed mine shaft to the building, then away again, circling into the forest. They were boot prints, work boots with deep treads, and they were fresh. The snow had stopped falling hours ago. These tracks had been made while we were in the building, while we were hearing the voices and the pickaxes and seeing the light. While something, many somethings, had walked right up to where we were sleeping. The tracks came within 5 feet of the building walls, circled it completely, and then led away. We followed them because they were heading in the direction we needed to go anyway, toward the river. Marcus kept muttering that this was impossible, that we were all experiencing some kind of group hallucination from bad air in the building. Carbon monoxide, maybe, or mold. Ellen didn't say anything, just walked with her flashlight pointed at the ground, following the tracks. They led us to the mine shaft. All of them. Every set of tracks converged at the broken seal and disappeared into the darkness. We stood there, the 4 of us in a loose group, staring at that opening in the ground. The smell of smoke was coming from inside, and deep in the shaft we could see that faint orange glow again. While we watched, something moved across it. A shadow, human-shaped but somehow wrong in its proportions, too tall and narrow, arms hanging too low. Then another shadow joined it, and another. They were gathering in there, watching us from the darkness. We ran. Professional assessment teams don't run from field sites. We're trained to stay calm and rational, but we ran. Through the snow, down the slope toward the river, using GPS and flashlights to navigate terrain we'd only surveyed in daylight. It took us 6 hours to reach a point where Ellen's satellite phone could get signal, and another 4 before a helicopter could reach us. The pilot asked why we'd called for emergency extraction, and Ellen told him equipment failure and unexpected weather. Nobody mentioned the mine shaft or the voices or the footprints. What would be the point? Who would believe us? The assessment was completed by a different team 2 months later. I read their report. They found elevated lead and arsenic levels around the old operations, standard contamination, nothing unusual. They made no mention of voices or shadows or tracks. The mine shaft seal had been reinforced with additional concrete, they noted, probably scheduled maintenance by the state. I know that's not true. Nobody reinforced that seal. Whatever was breaking through from inside either stopped trying or finished breaking through, and I don't know which possibility is worse. I don't do field work anymore. I transferred to a desk job, laboratory analysis instead of site surveys. People think I got soft or scared. Maybe I did. But sometimes, late at night in the lab when I'm working alone, I hear it. Faint and far away, but unmistakable. The sound of pickaxes striking stone and voices echoing up from somewhere deep below. I tell myself, it's just the building settling, pipes in the walls, anything reasonable. Then I pack up my work and leave, making sure to walk fast through the parking garage, making sure not to look at the shadows between the support pillars where something tall and narrow might be standing. Watching, waiting. Story 4. I inherited my grandmother's house in Kiana the winter after she died. I hadn't been there since I was a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, and my memories of the place were hazy at best. A small wooden house on the edge of the village, painted blue at some point, but faded to gray. A porch that sagged in the middle. A root cellar dug into the permafrost behind the kitchen. My grandmother, whose name was Eva Kotzebue, had lived alone there for decades after my grandfather passed. She was quiet, traditional, didn't talk much about the old ways, but everyone knew she remembered them. The house had been empty for 4 months when I finally made it up there in late November. The polar night was just settling in, that transitional period where you get maybe 2 hours of dim twilight at midday before the darkness closes back in. I'd planned to spend a week going through her things, deciding what to keep and what to let go, maybe doing some basic repairs before putting the house on the market. My aunt, who lived in Kotzebue, had offered to come help, but I told her I could manage. I wanted the time alone with my grandmother's memory, I guess. Wanted to feel close to her one more time. The inside of the house was exactly as I remembered it. Small rooms, low ceilings, walls covered in old photographs, and a few pieces of traditional artwork. My grandmother's furniture was ancient and heavy, the kind of stuff that lasts generations. Her bedroom still smelled like her, tallow and wood smoke and something herbal I couldn't identify. I spent the first day just walking through the rooms, touching things, remembering fragments of childhood visits. There was a comfort in it, despite the circumstances. She'd lived a full life and died in her sleep at 93. As deaths go, it was about as good as you could hope for. The root cellar door was in the kitchen floor, a heavy wooden hatch with an iron ring for a handle. I remembered being fascinated by it as a kid, how it opened onto a ladder leading down into cold darkness. My grandmother used to store preserved fish and berries down there, kept them frozen year-round in the permafrost. I hadn't planned to go down. The estate lawyer said I could leave any food storage. It wasn't worth dealing with, but on my second night there, I heard something from below. It was maybe 9 or 10 at night, full dark outside, and I was sitting at my grandmother's table reading some of her old letters when I heard it. A scraping sound, like something being dragged across stone. It came from beneath me, from the root cellar, clear enough that I looked down at the hatch expecting to see it opening. It didn't. The scraping continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. I sat there listening, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, the permafrost shifting, normal old house sounds. But I'd heard plenty of old houses settle, and this wasn't that. I opened the hatch. I'm not sure why. Curiosity, probably, or maybe just wanting to prove to myself there was nothing down there to be concerned about. The ladder descended about 8 feet into a small chamber carved out of frozen earth and stone. My grandmother had strung a single bulb down there that ran off the house generator, and when I pulled the cord, it flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the walls. The root cellar was maybe 10 feet square, with rough shelves built into the earthen walls. Most of the shelves were empty now, just a few forgotten jars of berries covered in frost. What caught my attention was the floor. Someone had drawn on it in what looked like charcoal or ash. A large circle, maybe 5 feet in diameter, with symbols around the inside edge. I recognized a few of them from my grandmother's artwork, traditional Inupiaq designs, but others were unfamiliar. In the center of the circle was a small pile of objects, a carved bone knife, several bundles of dried grass tied with sinew, and what looked like animal teeth arranged in a pattern. It was clearly intentional, clearly meaningful, but I had no idea what it meant. I should mention that my grandmother had been traditional in her beliefs. She'd grown up in an era when the old practices were still common, before Christianity and modern life pushed them to the margins. I knew she'd kept some of those traditions alive, though she'd never talked about them explicitly with me. Looking at the circle and the objects, I wondered if this was some kind of protective ritual, or maybe just something she'd done out of habit, out of respect for the ways she'd been taught as a girl. I took a picture with my phone, figuring my aunt might know what it meant, then climbed back up and closed the hatch. The scraping sound didn't repeat that night, and I told myself I'd imagined it, misheard something else. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the circle, about what my grandmother had been protecting against or keeping contained. Those were very different possibilities, and I didn't like either one. The next day I called my aunt and described what I'd found. There was a long silence on the phone, then she said, "You need to leave that alone. Don't touch anything down there. Don't disturb it. Your grandmother knew what she was doing." When I pressed her for more information, she got uncomfortable, said it wasn't her place to explain, that some knowledge was meant to stay with the people who held it. If my grandmother hadn't taught me about the circle, then maybe I wasn't meant to know. I found that frustrating, but also oddly respectful. I promised I wouldn't touch anything in the root cellar. That night the scraping came back, louder this time, and it was accompanied by something else. A voice, low and rhythmic, speaking words I didn't understand. The language was unfamiliar, not English or Inupiaq. Maybe not language at all, just sounds that felt like words, that carried meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I sat up in my grandmother's bed, listening to this voice drift up through the floorboards, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The voice went on for hours, rising and falling, sometimes almost singing, sometimes harsh and demanding. I pulled the blankets over my head like a child and waited for dawn that wouldn't come. Morning, such as it was, arrived as a slight lessening of the darkness outside. I was exhausted, frightened in a way I couldn't articulate, and seriously considering just packing up and leaving. But that felt like abandoning my grandmother somehow, like failing to honor her memory by not seeing this through. So instead I made coffee, ate a breakfast I didn't taste, and decided to call the village elder my aunt had mentioned. His name was Thomas Kavanagh, and he'd known my grandmother for decades. Thomas came by that afternoon. He was in his 80s, moved slowly but with purpose, and he had eyes that seemed to see more than what was in front of him. I showed him the root cellar, and he descended the ladder with surprising ease. He stayed down there for maybe 10 minutes while I waited above, hearing him murmur something in Inupiaq. When he came back up, his expression was grave. "Your grandmother was keeping something bound," he said. "Something she'd trapped a long time ago, maybe before you were born. The circle keeps it contained, but the circle is old. It's weakening." He looked at me carefully, measuring something. She would have renewed it periodically, kept it strong. With her gone, it's starting to break down. I asked what would happen if it broke completely. Thomas shook his head. "Nothing good. These things, when they're bound for a long time, they get angry, resentful. If it gets free, it won't leave peacefully." He paused. "I can renew the circle, strengthen it again, but you'll need to maintain it after I'm gone, or find someone who can. This is a generational responsibility now. Your grandmother passed it to you when she left you the house." We renewed the circle that evening. Thomas brought materials, ash from a specific type of wood, herbs I didn't recognize, other things he didn't explain. He redrew the symbols, replaced the objects in the center with fresh ones, and spoke words in Inupiaq for almost an hour. I sat on the kitchen floor above the open hatch, watching and listening, trying to memorize what he was doing. When he finished, the temperature in the root cellar seemed to drop even further, and the air felt heavier, more still. Thomas climbed up, closed the hatch, and drew one final symbol on the wood with white ash. "That should hold," he said. "But check it monthly. If the symbol on the hatch starts to fade, call me or your aunt. Don't let it disappear completely." He left after declining my offer of coffee, moving back out into the darkness with his flashlight, and I was alone again in my grandmother's house. I stayed 3 more days, going through her things, sorting and packing. Every night I checked the hatch, and every night the symbol was still clear, bright white against the dark wood. The scraping and the voice didn't return. Whatever my grandmother had bound down there remained bound, at least for now. But I could feel it sometimes, a presence beneath the floor, patient and waiting, It had waited decades already. It could wait longer. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't, not with the knowledge of what was trapped beneath it. Instead, I arranged to have someone from the village check on it monthly, paid them well for their trouble, and I visit every few months myself. Thomas taught me how to renew the circle properly, and I've done it 3 times now. Each time I wonder what I'm keeping contained, what my grandmother captured down there all those years ago. Thomas says it's better not to know, that some things are safer when they remain unnamed. I'm inclined to believe him. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Anchorage, I dream about the root cellar. In the dreams, the circle is broken, the symbols scattered, and something is climbing up the ladder into the house. Something with too many joints in its limbs. Something that speaks in that low rhythmic voice. Something that's been waiting a very long time for someone to make a mistake. I always wake up before I see its face, if it has a face. Maybe that's a mercy. Maybe my grandmother is still protecting me even from beyond. I hope so. I'm going to need all the protection I can get, carrying this responsibility for the rest of my life. Story 5. The survey crew I was working with had set up camp about 30 miles north of the Brooks Range, right at the edge where the mountains meet the coastal plain. We were doing geological surveys for a mining company. Preliminary assessment, nothing invasive, just ground-penetrating radar and core samples to see if the mineral deposits were worth pursuing. There were 6 of us. Myself, 2 other geologists named Rachel Winters and David Chen, 2 equipment techs, and our camp coordinator, Alana Mitchell, who kept everything running smoothly. We'd been out there for 2 weeks, with 2 more weeks to go before extraction. The polar night was in full effect, had been for weeks already, and we were all starting to feel it. That peculiar psychological weight of endless darkness, even with our LED camp lights and work schedules designed to maintain circadian rhythm. We'd set up a good camp, heated tents, proper facilities, kitchen area, the works. Professional operation, safe and organized. Nothing should have gone wrong. For the first 2 weeks, nothing did. It was Rachel who first mentioned the lights. We were sitting in the common tent after dinner, reviewing the day's survey data. When she said, "Did anyone else see lights out on the plain last night? Like headlamps, but distant?" The rest of us shook our heads. We were the only people for 50 miles in any direction, and the nearest village was too far away for headlamps to be visible. Rachel shrugged it off, said she must have been seeing things, but I could tell it bothered her. She kept glancing out the tent window like she expected to see the lights again. The next night I saw them too. I'd gotten up around 3 a.m. to use the latrine. We had a proper composting setup, very civilized, and on my way back I saw them. Small lights, maybe 6 or 7 of them, moving slowly across the plain to the east. They were too far away to make out details, just points of light in the darkness, but their movement was deliberate, not random, not erratic. They were traveling in a line, maintaining equal spacing, heading north. I watched them for maybe 5 minutes before they disappeared over a rise. My first thought was another research team, but we would have been notified if anyone else was operating in our area. My second thought was locals. But again, the nearest village was at Kasuk, and that was a solid 70 miles away. I mentioned it at breakfast, and David admitted he'd seen them too 2 nights earlier. "I thought they were just our own team members doing night work," he said. "But when I checked the schedule, no one was supposed to be out on the plain." Alana suggested caribou with reflective eye shine, which was possible, except the lights were too steady, too organized. Animals don't move in perfect formation like that. We decided to mention it in our daily radio check with Base, see if they had any information about other operations in the area. Base confirmed we were the only registered team within 100 miles. They suggested atmospheric phenomena, light refraction, aurora effects, something environmental. We accepted that explanation because it was easier than the alternatives, but none of us really believed it. That night, the lights appeared again, closer this time. I could see them from inside the common tent, moving across our survey grid about half a mile out. We all saw them this time, all 6 of us, and we watched them travel from east to west, taking maybe 20 minutes to traverse our field of view before disappearing into the darkness. "We should go look," one of the equipment techs said. His name was Connor Patel. "Tomorrow, in the daylight. See if there are tracks, see what they are." It seemed reasonable. We'd all been trained in field safety. We had GPS and communication equipment, and we were curious. Scientists and techs are paid to be curious, to investigate unknowns. The next day, Rachel, David, and I took an ATV out where we'd seen the lights. Connor came too, bringing a camera to document anything we found. We found tracks, not footprints exactly, more like drag marks in the snow. Long parallel grooves, maybe 3 inches wide, dozens of them side by side, creating a path about 10 feet across. They ran in a straight line from east to west, exactly where we'd seen the lights traveling. The grooves were deep, like something heavy had been dragged, and they were uniform, same depth, same width, same spacing throughout. Between the grooves were small round impressions, maybe 2 inches across, also in regular patterns. We photographed everything, took measurements, collected a few snow samples from inside the grooves, though I wasn't sure what we expected to find. "This doesn't make sense," Rachel said. She was kneeling next to one of the grooves, running her hand along its edge. "What kind of equipment leaves tracks like this? And why would anyone be dragging something across the plain in the middle of the night?" No one had answers. We followed the tracks for about 2 miles in each direction, west toward where they disappeared into rougher terrain, east toward where they originated. The eastern end just stopped. No source point, no indication of where whatever made them had come from. They simply began in the middle of nowhere and continued west. Back at camp, we reviewed our photographs and argued theories. Geological formations we weren't familiar with, ice structures, wind patterns creating unusual surface effects. Nothing quite fit. The grooves were too regular, too clearly intentional. Alana suggested we pack up and extract early, that we'd completed enough of our survey to satisfy the preliminary contract. But we were contracted for 4 weeks, and leaving early would have financial implications none of us wanted to deal with. We decided to stay but increase security protocols. No one outside alone at night, all movement logged and coordinated. Weapons check, we had bear rifles, standard for Arctic field work. The lights came closer that night, not half a mile away this time, maybe 100 yards from the camp perimeter. We could see them clearly now, and they weren't lights at all. They were pale shapes, vaguely human in size, but not in form, and they glowed with a faint bioluminescence. 7 of them, moving in that same precise line, and as they moved, they made a sound. A low droning, almost mechanical, that vibrated through the ground. We felt it in our tents, in our bones. The shapes moved past the camp, never deviating from their westward path, and where they passed the snow was pressed into those same parallel grooves. We should have called for immediate extraction. Alana tried, actually got on the radio, and declared an emergency situation. But base said the weather was too dangerous for flight. A storm system moving in, they couldn't risk a helicopter until it passed. Earliest extraction would be 36 hours. We were told to shelter in place, maintain camp security, wait it out. So we waited, all of us crowded into the common tent, rifles loaded and ready, though none of us thought bullets would make any difference. The shapes came back an hour later. They approached from the west this time, moving east, retracing their path. Still in that precise line, still making that droning sound, but now they stopped. Right at the edge of our camp, maybe 20 yards from the nearest tent, they stopped and turned toward us. 7 pale shapes standing motionless in the darkness, and I could see them in detail now that made my stomach turn. They weren't human. They had the rough outline of human proportions, a body, limbs, something like a head. but they were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at too many joints, and their heads, if those were heads, were smooth and featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just blank pale surfaces turned in our direction. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The droning sound intensified, became almost painful, a pressure in my skull that made my vision blur. Then, one by one, they sank into the snow, not walking away, not departing, sinking straight down like the ground was swallowing them. In less than a minute, they were gone, leaving behind only those parallel grooves and the memory of their presence. None of us slept. We stayed in the common tent, lights on, heaters running full blast against a cold that felt like it was coming from inside rather than outside. We talked in quiet voices about what we'd seen, trying to rationalize it, finding no rational explanation that satisfied. At some point, David suggested they might be some kind of Arctic phenomenon, creatures adapted to live beneath the ice and snow, surfacing periodically. It was better than aliens or ghosts, I guess. Better than admitting we had no idea what we'd witnessed. The helicopter came 30 hours later, right on schedule. We loaded our essential equipment, abandoned the rest. The pilot asked why we all looked so shaken, and Alana told him equipment failure and harsh conditions, nothing specific. During the flight out, I looked down at the plain where we'd been camped. The tracks were still visible from the air, 2 parallel lines running east to west across the snow for miles, maybe 20 or 30 miles, far longer than we'd realized. They disappeared into the Brooks Range to the west and stretched to the horizon in the east. Whatever we'd seen was just a small part of something much larger, a migration or journey that covered vast distances through territory no human ever witnessed. The mining company never pursued the site. Our survey data was apparently insufficient, they said, though I suspect Alana told them more than she included in the official report. I still have the photographs on my phone, the ones of the grooves and the impressions. Sometimes I scroll through them late at night, studying the patterns, trying to understand what I saw. I've done some research, carefully, quietly, talking to other geologists who've worked in Arctic regions. 2 of them mentioned seeing similar tracks, similar lights. Neither wanted to discuss it in detail. This is knowledge people carry privately, I think, not wanting to be dismissed or ridiculed. I don't do Arctic work anymore. I transferred to temperate regions, places where the night is just night and not a months-long void where things can move unseen. But I think about those shapes sometimes, about their precise formation and their purposeful movement. They were going somewhere, or coming from somewhere, traveling beneath the ice and snow on a journey that predates human presence in the Arctic by who knows how long. We intersected with them for one night, witnessed a fragment of something vast and ancient, and I'm grateful we were allowed to leave. I don't think we were ever in real danger. I think they simply didn't care about us, the way you don't care about insects when you're walking to an important destination. We were beneath notice. That's almost more unsettling than if they'd been actively hostile. Story 6. I was working as a contractor for the National Weather Service, maintaining a remote automated weather station about 90 miles inland from Barrow. The station was on a low hill, barely qualified as a hill, really, maybe 60 feet of elevation, in the middle of flat tundra that extended to the horizon in every direction. My job was to visit quarterly, check the instruments, replace batteries, clear any ice buildup, and confirm everything was transmitting data properly. It was supposed to be a 2-day job. Fly in, camp overnight, fly out. Simple, routine, decent pay for minimal work. I'd done this exact maintenance run 4 times already over the past year, always in summer or early fall when there was at least some daylight to work with. But the station had started reporting irregular data in late November, temperature and pressure readings that fluctuated wildly. And my supervisor asked me to make an emergency winter visit to troubleshoot. I wasn't thrilled about working during polar night. but the pay for emergency calls was triple my normal rate, and I needed the money. My daughter was starting college in the fall, so I said yes, packed cold weather gear, and caught a bush plane out of Utqiagvik on a clear December afternoon. The pilot, whose name I think was Eric Larson, dropped me on a flat stretch of tundra about half a mile from the weather station. We'd used this landing site before. The ground was solid, relatively smooth, marked with a reflective pole so it was easy to spot. Eric said he'd be back in 36 hours, weather permitting, and to call on the satellite phone if I needed to adjust the pickup time. Then he took off, and I was alone in the darkness with my gear and the wind and the absolute crushing silence that follows when an engine noise fades away. I set up my tent at the base of the hill, using the station's maintenance shelter as a windbreak. The shelter was just a small plywood box, maybe 8 by 8 feet, with a door that didn't lock and enough room for emergency supplies and equipment storage. I'd slept in there once during a summer storm, but it wasn't insulated, and I preferred my own 4-season tent for overnight stays. With camp established, I climbed the hill to start the station assessment. The instruments looked fine at first glance. No visible ice damage, no loose connections, solar panels clean. But when I checked the data logger, I saw what the irregular readings were. The station was recording temperatures, but not from its instruments. There was a secondary data stream, unlabeled, that had started appearing 3 weeks earlier. It showed temperature readings from a source about 30 feet underground, directly below the station. That was impossible. The station had no underground sensors. It was a surface weather station only, measuring air temperature, wind, pressure, precipitation. Nothing was buried. I spent an hour checking every connection, every cable, trying to figure out where the phantom data stream was coming from. My best guess was signal interference, some kind of electronic crosstalk, picking up data from another station and misattributing it. But the underground temperatures didn't match any nearby station's readings, and the pattern was wrong. The temperatures fluctuated randomly, sometimes minus 40 Celsius, sometimes minus 10, sometimes 0, or even above freezing. Underground temperatures in permafrost are supposed to be stable, varying only slightly with depth and season. This was chaotic. I radioed my supervisor from the satellite phone, described what I was seeing. He was as confused as I was, asked me to do a complete system reset and see if the phantom data stream persisted. So I shut down the station, waited 10 minutes, powered it back up, and watched the logger restart. For about 5 minutes it recorded normally, just the surface instruments, data patterns I recognized. Then the secondary stream appeared again. Underground temperatures, 30 feet down, showing 0 degrees Celsius, water freezing point. That was wrong for so many reasons I couldn't even begin to list them. It was probably around 7 p.m. Not that time meant much in polar night when I noticed the vibration. I was still at the station, making notes on the data anomaly, when I felt it through my boots. A faint tremor, rhythmic, like machinery running somewhere deep below. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I stood there on top of the hill, waiting to see if it would repeat, but there was only silence and wind. Earthquake was my first thought, but we weren't in a seismically active region, and the vibration was too regular, too patterned. Earthquakes don't pulse with mechanical precision. I climbed down to my tent, ate a dinner of freeze-dried something, and tried to rationalize what I'd felt. Maybe military operations, though I'd have been notified if anything was scheduled in the area. Maybe oil exploration, though again, permits and notifications would have been filed. Maybe natural gas venting from permafrost, creating vibrations as it escaped. That seemed most likely, and it would explain the temperature anomalies too. Gas movement underground could create localized heating. I felt better with that explanation. It made sense. I decided to mention it in my report and let someone with more geological expertise evaluate it. The vibration came back around midnight. Stronger this time, strong enough to wake me from light sleep, and it lasted longer. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes of steady pulsing, a rhythm I could almost count. 8 beats, pause, 8 beats, pause. It stopped, and I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind and wondering if I should call for early extraction. But what would I say that I felt vibrations and found weird data readings? That wasn't an emergency. That was just something unusual that warranted further investigation by the appropriate team. I told myself to wait until morning, to finish my assessment, to not waste the emergency extraction option on what might be nothing. The light appeared around 3 a.m. I'd gotten up to check the weather station again, worried that the vibrations might be damaging the instruments somehow, and from the top of the hill I saw it. A faint glow from the tundra, about a quarter mile to the northeast, barely visible, like someone had buried a lantern just beneath the surface of the snow. As I watched, it brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, pulsing in that same 8-beat rhythm. 8 pulses of light, pause, 8 more pulses. I'm not sure what possessed me to walk toward it. Curiosity, maybe, or professional obligation to investigate anything unusual in my work area. I took my GPS, my satellite phone, a flashlight, and I hiked out across the tundra toward the glow. The snow was crusty enough to support my weight, which was good, and the wind had died down to almost nothing, which was eerie. Quarter mile doesn't sound far, but in darkness on unfamiliar terrain, it took me almost 20 minutes to reach the source of the light. It was coming from a hole in the ground. Not a crack or a natural opening. A hole, circular, maybe 4 feet in diameter, perfectly round like it had been drilled. The edges were smooth, and when I shone my flashlight down, I couldn't see the bottom. Just darkness extending down beyond my light's reach, and from somewhere deep below, that pulsing glow. The light was pale blue, cold-looking, and when it pulsed, I felt the vibration again through my boots. Whatever was making the light was also making the vibrations. I should have left right then. Should have walked back to my tent, called for emergency extraction, and let someone else investigate. But I was leaning over the hole, trying to see deeper, trying to understand what I was looking at, when I heard the sound. It came from below, echoing up through the hole. A mechanical grinding, like gears turning, like something large and heavy being moved, and beneath that, another sound. Breathing. Deep, slow breathing, or something that sounded like breathing, the rhythmic movement of air that accompanies life. The light pulsed 8 times, and in each pulse I saw something moving in the depths, something pale rising toward the surface, climbing or being lifted. I couldn't tell which. It was still far below, but it was ascending, and I could make out a shape now. Cylindrical, segmented, each segment maybe 6 feet long, and there were many segments, dozens. A long, pale shape rising through the hole with that terrible patience, moving in time with the pulses. I ran, dropped my flashlight, forgot about GPS and caution and proper field procedures, and just ran back toward my tent. The distance felt endless, and behind me I heard the grinding sound intensify, heard something emerge from the hole with a wet sliding noise that carried across the empty tundra. I didn't look back. I reached my tent, grabbed the satellite phone, and called Eric. He answered on the second ring, sounding groggy. "Emergency extraction," I said. "Right now. I don't care about the weather. I don't care about the time. You need to come get me right now." He must have heard something in my voice because he didn't argue, didn't ask questions. He just said he'd be there in 40 minutes and to activate my GPS beacon so he could find the landing site in the darkness. I packed my essential gear with shaking hands, left the tent standing, left most of my equipment. 40 minutes felt like hours, but Eric was true to his word. I heard the plane engine before I saw it, felt the most intense relief I've ever experienced when his landing lights swept across the tundra. I was in the plane with my gear before he'd even finished taxiing, and I told him to take off immediately. "What about the weather station?" he asked as we climbed. I told him to forget it, that someone else could deal with it later, that I was done. He gave me a look, but didn't press. From the air I could see the hole. Easier to spot now because the light was brighter, pulsing faster, and around it the snow was disturbed in a wide circle. Something had emerged and moved away, leaving tracks or drag marks that radiated outward from the hole like spokes on a wheel. I didn't see the thing itself. Maybe it had moved off, or maybe it had gone back underground. I didn't care. I just wanted distance. I quit the contractor position 2 days later, sent an email to my supervisor explaining equipment malfunction and personal safety concerns, declined to elaborate when he called asking for details. I don't know if anyone ever went back to that weather station. Don't know if the hole is still there or if it closed somehow. The station still transmits data according to the NWS website. I've checked more times than I should admit, and it still shows those phantom underground temperature readings. Sometimes they spike to 0 degrees. Sometimes they go even higher, above freezing, which should be impossible in Arctic permafrost. I dream about that hole sometimes, about the pale segmented thing climbing toward the surface, about what might have happened if I'd stayed there watching instead of running. In the dreams, I see it emerge completely, see its full length and form, and I always wake up before I can process what I'm seeing. Maybe that's my mind protecting me from understanding. Maybe some things are too far outside human experience for us to safely comprehend. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not knowing, with letting that mystery stay buried in the darkness where it belongs. I just wish I could stop checking the weather station data, stop looking at those temperature spikes and wondering what they mean, what's moving around down there in the frozen earth beneath the Arctic night. Story 7. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I'd met maybe twice at parties in Anchorage. When he heard I was looking for a quiet place to work on my novel for a few weeks, he offered it immediately. Said it was out past Delta Junction, way out on an old homestead trail, but it was in good shape and I was welcome to use it. No charge, just keep an eye on the place and let him know if anything needed repairs. It seemed perfect. Isolation, no distractions, the kind of environment where I could finally make progress on the manuscript I'd been stalling on for 2 years. The directions were surprisingly complicated. Drive the Richardson Highway to a specific mile marker, turn onto an unmarked trail, follow it for 12 miles, look for a blue barrel on the left side marking the final turnoff. The trail was rough, barely more than 2 ruts in the snow, and my Subaru struggled but managed. The cabin appeared suddenly in my headlights, a small log structure with a metal roof and a covered porch. It looked exactly like the photos I'd been shown, rustic but maintained with a good stack of firewood under a tarp and smoke coming from the... Wait, no. There shouldn't be smoke. The place was supposed to be empty. I sat in my car with the engine running, staring at the cabin. Smoke was definitely coming from the chimney, thin and grey against the black sky. My first thought was squatters, someone using the empty cabin without permission. My second thought was that the owner had mixed up his dates, that someone else had legitimate access and we'd been double booked. I considered turning around and driving back, calling to sort out the confusion, but I was exhausted from the drive and it was nearly midnight. I decided to at least knock and see who was there. The porch light was on. That surprised me. The owner had said the cabin was on a generator that needed to be manually started, that I'd probably arrive to a dark building and have to get systems running. But there was definitely power, light showing through the gaps around the curtained windows. I knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. I tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside was warm, the wood stove radiating heat, and there was a cup of coffee on the table. The coffee was still steaming. Someone had been here minutes ago, maybe was still here. "Hello," I called out. "Sorry to intrude, I think there might be a scheduling mix-up." No response. The cabin was only 1 room plus a small loft, nowhere for someone to hide. I checked anyway. Looked under the loft, opened the closet, even glanced in the outhouse attached to the back. Empty. Completely empty. I should have left. That's obvious in retrospect. But it was late, I was tired, and there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe the owner had come out earlier in the day to get the cabin ready, started the fire and the generator, made himself coffee, then left before I arrived. The timing would have to be incredibly coincidental for the coffee to still be hot, but it was possible. I decided to stay the night and call him in the morning to clarify. I brought in my bags, set up my laptop on the table, poured the mystery coffee into the sink and made my own. The cabin was cozy despite the weirdness. Good lighting, comfortable furniture, a decent selection of books on a shelf. I ate a late dinner from my cooler, got a fire going properly in the stove and tried to settle in. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The curtains were drawn, which was good, but I found myself glancing at them constantly, expecting them to move, expecting to see a face pressed against the window. Nothing. Just my paranoia getting the better of me. I was halfway through my first chapter review when I heard footsteps on the porch. Clear, deliberate footsteps, boots on wood, coming up to the door. Then a knock, 3 sharp raps. I froze. Laptop forgotten. "Hello," I called. No answer, just another 3 knocks. I stood, went to the door, called through it. "Who's there?" Silence. I waited maybe 30 seconds, building up courage, then opened the door quickly. Nothing. No one on the porch. No one in the clearing around the cabin. But there were footprints in the snow. They came up the porch steps, crossed to the door, then turned and went back down. I followed them with my flashlight, tracking them across the clearing toward the tree line, where they disappeared. Not faded away, not obscured by snow, just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished mid-step. The prints themselves were strange too, now that I looked closely. They were boot prints, definitely boots, but they were shallow. Too shallow for someone heavy enough to make that solid knocking sound I'd heard on the door. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a chair under the handle for good measure. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 tries to get the chair positioned right. I considered leaving immediately, driving back through the darkness despite my exhaustion, but the trail had been difficult enough in one direction. Attempting it at night, distracted and frightened, seemed like a good way to slide off into a ditch and freeze to death. I decided to wait until dawn, or what passed for dawn during polar night, that brief period of twilight, and then get out. The knocking came again around 2 a.m. Same pattern, 3 sharp raps, impossibly loud. I didn't answer, didn't move from where I was sitting rigid on the couch. The knocking repeated every few minutes for an hour. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps. Sometimes on the door, sometimes on the walls, once on the window right behind my head. I pulled the curtain aside at that last one, shone my flashlight through the glass, and saw nothing outside. Just darkness and snow and those shallow footprints circling the cabin now, dozens of them, creating a trail that wound around the building again and again. When the knocking finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse. I sat on the couch with my flashlight and the fire poker, waiting for dawn, listening to the cabin creak and the wind outside. At some point, I must have dozed because I jerked awake to find it was 4:30 a.m. And something was different. The cup I'd poured coffee from earlier, the one I'd dumped in the sink, it was back on the table, full of fresh coffee, steaming gently. I ran, didn't pack my bags, didn't turn off the generator, didn't even close the door properly behind me. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove back down that nightmare trail as fast as I dared. It took almost 2 hours to reach the highway, and by the time I did, my hands had cramped on the steering wheel and my jaw ached from clenching my teeth. I drove straight to Fairbanks, checked into a hotel, and slept for 12 hours straight. I called the cabin owner the next day and told him I'd had to leave early. Family emergency. Very sorry. He accepted that without question, then mentioned something casually that made my blood run cold. "Oh," he said, "did you notice the coffee? I keep asking people to pour it out when they leave, but somehow there's always a fresh cup when the next person arrives. Weird, right? I've been meaning to figure out where it comes from." I asked how many people had used the cabin this winter. He said I was the fourth. The first stayed a week with no problems. The second left after 2 days. Wouldn't explain why. The third lasted one night like me and also cited a family emergency. The owner seemed to think it was funny, this pattern of people leaving suddenly. I didn't tell him about the knocking or the footprints or the coffee that refilled itself. What would be the point? He clearly either didn't experience these things himself or had rationalized them away. I never finished my novel. Every time I sit down to work on it, I think about that cabin, about the warm coffee and the footprints and the knocking that came from something that wasn't there. I think about whoever or whatever wanted me to stay, who kept making coffee like they were trying to be hospitable, trying to make me feel welcome. That's almost worse than overt hostility somehow. The idea that something was trying to be friendly, trying to interact with me in the only way it knew how, not understanding why I found it terrifying. The owner still rents out the cabin. I've seen posts about it on homesteading forums, people asking for recommendations for remote writing retreats. I've thought about warning them, but what would I say? That something knocks on the door at night, that coffee appears from nowhere, they'd think I was crazy or making up stories for attention. So I stay silent, and I hope that whoever stays there has a better experience than I did. Or maybe I hope they have the same experience and leave just as fast. So that thing in the cabin, whatever it is, stays alone in the darkness where it belongs, making coffee for guests who never stay long enough to drink it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.